Hello, and welcome back to the Piping Pastor Theology Talks. Today we'll be continuing our series on soteriology by discussing what we need to be saved from. Well, I recently got some tobaccos from the Country Squire. I mentioned in a previous video, it was my International Pipe Smoking Day gift to myself. And they came in the mail a couple of days ago. So I'm very excited. I got Bag End, King's Foil, and Green Dragon, which is what's in the Boswell pipe today, is the Green Dragon, which is a blend of Virginias, air cured and flue cured Virginias. As I mentioned previously, the Country Squire has a great deal of aromatics, much like Boswell. They lean towards the aromatics, and I'm not an aromatic smoker so much. In point of fact, I have only one aromatic tobacco in my rotation, which is Eileen Stream, and I rarely smoke it. I prefer the natural flavors of tobaccos. Now, that being said, there is a difference between casing and topping. For those of you who have been smoking pipes for years, of course, you'll know this, but a topping is, cherry wine, or like in the case of Eileen Stream, white chocolate truffle. It's an artificial flavor that's added into the tobacco. Usually, you'll see a lot of black Cavendish in those blends because it picks up the flavors of the topping, or the topping that's put on. Casing, on the other hand, is more natural flavors that are meant to accentuate and bring out the natural flavors of the tobacco. So you'll see things like sugar and honey and molasses and so on and so forth. So Peter Stokkebye's Luxury Twist Flake is an example, which is a wonderful blend. And those I'm fine with, because that's rather more like seasoning a steak, or adding a bit of sea salt to some caramel to bring out the sweetness. So casings I don't mind so much, but it's the toppings I'm kind of like, I understand why people go that route, and why a lot of pipe smokers start with aromatics, because they are easier and more familiar, perhaps. But for me, it's never been the ticket. So the only three non-aromatic blends they had at the Country Squire were these three. So it's really nice. It's lovely and sweet and complex. I'd say that's a winner. Sadly, I already brewed some coffee. This would have gone much better with, I think, a cup of tea, but afraid this strong dark coffee that I have the habit of drinking might override that a bit. But still lovely tobacco. So I've decided to cellar. I got enough to fill 6 ball canning jars. I use ball canning jars, as many of you do, to store my tobaccos, and happily they're from Indiana, as I am originally. So I'm supporting a fellow group of Hoosiers in the purchase of ball canning jars. Yeah, it's very nice. So I have 6 jars that are cellaring away. I kept a wee bit out of each one to try them. I was sure I'd like them. They got too many good reviews for them to not be good. So I decided before I even opened them up, they were going to be something I'd cellar for a few years. But I wanted to have at least a wee bit of a smoke just to enjoy them right now. Well, as I said, today we're continuing our discussion of soteriology. What are we being saved from? Now, of course, the easy answer for those in the Christian tradition, or who are familiar with Christian tradition, will say, well, it's sin. We say humans are naturally sinful, sin entered the world, so on and so forth. We are corrupt in our human nature. We are imperfect now after creation. So because of our sinful nature, we are separated from God. So we need to be saved from that sin to be reconciled with God. However, that suggests, first of all, that we have a sinful nature, which is assumed often in Christian theology, but not necessarily by everyone, and that it's something from which we can be. It's something that separates us from God, and something that can be somehow covered over or um, paid for in some manner in order that we can be reconciled to God. So the story we take for granted is that God created the universe perfect, and God saw that it was good. And then sin entered the world through one person. So where did the sin come from? That's the first question to wrestle with. Did God also create sin? Well, that can't be the case, right? Because God is perfect. And if God created the sin, then God would be familiar with sin, and therefore our sinful nature would not preclude us from relationship with God because it would have come from God, right? So that can't be the answer. It can't be part of God's nature. And sin, most often defined in Christian circles anyway, is missing the mark. Uh, Essentially, it's behavior that separates us from God. It is unholy behavior. It is selfishness. It's the pride of the eyes, pride of the life, or pride of life, lust of the eyes, lust of the flesh, pride of life. I know I'd get it there eventually. Um, Basically, it all boils down to idolatry. It puts us down as worshiping something, someone, or some set of circumstances above and beyond God. It's placing something or someone in the place of God, which obviously separates us from God. So, where did that come from? How did that enter into the universe? Well, there are a few theories. First of all, there is the best of all possible worlds theory, right? Um, if you go back to the very beginning of the universe, 13.6 billion years ago, and you look at the four natural forces who were all adjusted to be in perfect unison in order for the universe to expand and so on and so forth and get to where it is now. Some people say, well, look, there's only so many ways that could have happened that would have supported intelligent life. So, in that scenario, human will, free will, so on and so forth, has to be kind of baked into the mix as for that to happen. Or for God to create a universe in which free will existed, there had to be the opportunity for sin, the possibility of sin. Which again, if sin were removed, then free will is removed. Then we are all just a bunch of automatons, and we're essentially an extension of God's self with no consciousness of our own. And then we are not in the image of God as many creators. Like I made the allusion to the water babies, right? So God creates because God is a creator. We are created in God's image. We are creators, which means we have a choice about what to create, when to create, how to create, and we have a choice of free will of whether or not to be in relationship with God. So the universe that we're in, where sin exists, is the best possible case scenario where we can still have a relationship with God, but then we have the choice to not be in relationship with God, which is what sin is. So we need God to rescue us, essentially, to save us from that separation. And how does that work, right? um, we're not talking about particular sinful acts necessarily. We can look at the various different legalistic interpretations of sin and the acts that people are supposed to and not supposed to do, and so on and so forth. And this is a sin, that's not a sin, so on and so forth. 10 Commandments being the easiest example to throw out there. Thou shalt not kill, right? So Thou shalt not covet thy neighbor's wife. Thou shalt honor God above all. Thou shalt, so on and so forth. All those thou shalt. So when you violate one of those 10 commandments, you have committed sin. You're separated from God. You need God to then reconcile you, because it's not something we can do on our end from our side. We cannot save ourselves. That's beyond our power, because we didn't set the rules. We didn't create the universe, and we're not the ones who put all of these things in motion. So the omniscient one, the all-powerful one, is the one who has to reach across the divide in order to be reconciled with us. So we choose sin, or we act sinfully, or we're separated from God. God's the one who steps across the chasm, right? Because if it were the other way, if we could do that, if we could step across the chasm and reconcile with God, we'd sin, say, okay, well, I'm sinned, separated. Let me just step over there and give God a hug, right away. Then that places all the decision-making power and all the acting power on our end. We could choose when to be saved, when not to be saved, and then God is not all-powerful. Then we have a God whose providence can be called into question. Now, the seeming contradiction there between free will and God's providence is dealt with in a couple of different ways. Calvin, of course, has double predestination to deal with that. I'm just comfortable in that tension. I don't understand it. I don't, and I've been studying theology at the highest levels at one of the top schools of divinity in the world for years. I've been published in this field. I've taught in this field. I've worked in pastoral ministry in churches and missions all over the world for years. And I'm comfortable saying, I don't know how that works. I don't know how we can have free will and God can still be completely sovereign. If I could figure that out, if I could figure out the entire mechanisms of salvation and God's action and our action towards God, well, then God would be something that I could write down in an equation and totally figure out, which obviously we can't. Because if we could, then God would not be much of a God. So here we have who is being saved was our first video, right? And we talked about the fact that it's not just humans, not just a completely anthropocentric view, but rather the all of creation, all the creation that is corrupted and then needs to be reconciled back to God. So we need to think of it in a more holistic sense, that when we think of salvation theory and soteriology, that we need to include non-human universe as well, being reconciled back to God. What are we being saved from? We're being saved from that separation we have from God in the initial intimate connection that we had with God. And if you follow young earth creation theory and you follow a literal interpretation of Genesis 1 and 2, for you, that is Adam and Eve walking in the garden, right? If you follow the scientific view of human evolution and so on and so forth, that is humans before we had developed consciousness to the level of understanding not only an other, but a divine other, when we lived in that more animalistic nature, where animals kind of exist, where they're with God and they don't really have any conscious choice, one way or the other necessarily. Going from there to conscious thought to the point where we could say no to the divine reality, that's where separation enters the world. And that's when we stop living in balance with nature. I mean, living in such a way that we can control and dictate the formation of our planet, in the Anthropocene in which we now live, having a geologic effect on the world, affecting geological change. That's where we currently reside. So there is a separation between us and God because we have consciousness and because we have choice. So that is what we need to be saved from. It doesn't mean we need to have choice removed. Doesn't mean we need to return to an animalistic kind of existence, but it means that God needs to step across that divide and reconcile back with us. That is the need of salvation. That is what we need to be saved from, separation from God. So that is it for this time. So we've talked about who is being saved, what are we being saved from, and the next one is who is doing the saving. So we'll get into that in our next video. Until then, have a lovely week, and as always, happy reading.